Quiet on the Set is a documentary that's been released now on the formerly HBO Max, now Max streaming service about the history, the dark behind the scenes history of being a child actor during one of the biggest eras for being a child actor on television, which was the mid to late 90s and the 2000s over at Nickelodeon. Now, I think I'm relatively qualified to talk about that era because I will tell you, because I was a kid that was born in the 80s but raised mostly in the 90s, Nickelodeon was probably the most watched television network in my household that I watched for like a good decade. It was Nickelodeon, it was Cartoon Network. When it comes to cable, those had more viewings during a 10-year span of my life than any other network on cable in my house. Maybe Univision and Telemundo were higher because my parents had those on around the clock, but Nickelodeon was a staple of childhood for a lot of kids. Now, I happened to be there during the changeover in the mid 90s when Dan Schneider was sort of like his rise to power, when shows like All That and later Kenan and Kel and the Amanda Show became staples of the network. They kind of focused on a lot more of this sort of sketch comedy sitcom type of entertainment. And it wasn't the first time they had done stuff like this, because Nickelodeon did the You Can't Do That on Television show way, way before in the 80s. But it really hit a huge blasting point during the era of Snick, which was Nickelodeon's Saturday night television block. This documentary coming out, a lot of people have been talking about it, and I finally got around to watching it. It's on Max, as I stated. It's a 4-part documentary with part 5 being an epilogue. So the way it stands right now, the main sort of documentary is just 4 parts. Each one's about 45 or so minutes. And then you have the epilogue, which is more of a conversation and a reflection of what was discussed in the documentary. Now, the thing is, going into this documentary, I had some expectations because for a long time I had heard the rumors about Dan Schneider. Dan Schneider was the producer and one of the head writers over at Nickelodeon, responsible for helping All That and shows like that become so big. And he would go on to do, like I mentioned, the Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, a lot of the big shows. That was his baby. He was the guy in charge, and he became a superstar. He became an MVP at Nickelodeon. But there had been rumors for years all over the web. There had been stories that came out. I even remember hearing in the mid 2000s, I want to say mid to late 2000s, right around 2007, 2008, I remember listening to my local radio, and they were discussing these rumors about Dan Schneider and Jamie Lynn Spears. There were rumors about him having weird sort of fetishes, him getting massages from different cast members. There had been talks of, there was even a crazy rumor that he actually impregnated Jamie Lynn Spears. And I don't remember if she had the baby or if they had like an abortion. I don't remember the outcome. It was so long ago, but it did stick with me, that there was this, creepy producer who was preying on underage kids. And to my surprise, that's not exactly how this documentary goes. The documentary is really the beginning, the first part of the documentary, the part 1, the first episode, does zone in a lot. First of all, it talks about the importance of Nickelodeon, and they really do a good job of hammering home how big Nickelodeon was in the pre-internet era. I, ironically enough, stopped watching Nick right around 2000 or 2001. By that point, the Nickelodeon I had grown up with had kind of faded. I was obviously past puberty. I was in high school at that time, and I was sort of growing out of those Nickelodeon shows. Because the thing about Dan Schneider's comedy in those shows is that a lot of it doesn't really work as an adult. It's silly and goofy. It can be funny even now, but a lot of it didn't land with me the older I got. Some of this stuff I still love. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it was all bad. And obviously it worked. But also at that time, I was getting more into anime. I was watching more Cartoon Network because that kind of became like the more kid network that I had in my, at home. I just kind of slowly faded away from Nickelodeon. I really did. And it's just interesting timing. But because of that, I wasn't there for the era of Drake and Josh. I know about the show, obviously, because I have younger friends who have told me about it. And I had other friends who stayed watching Nick even back then. But the first part focuses on who Dan Schneider is, what he meant to Nickelodeon as far as the head writer, and it also focuses on it doesn't go into too much, a little bit of the creepy stuff and how a lot of the jokes back then were somewhat maybe inappropriate for kids. And interestingly enough, as I'm watching the documentary, I didn't really, I was thinking back to when these shows aired and I didn't even notice it. Like they were pointing out how there was a lot of sexual innuendo, and there was probably a couple things I noticed, but there were other scenes, like, for example, tons of slapstick comedy of like women having things sprayed in their face, obviously being a metaphor for, the climax. I'm trying to keep it somewhat PG and professional here, but you know what I'm trying to tell you, right? I didn't even notice that. I never took Nickelodeon as being like that. Interestingly enough, Mark Summers makes a very brief appearance at the beginning of the documentary, and he never appears again in the main story. Of course, Mark Summers was the host of Double Dare and What Would You Do, that was my era of Nick. And he didn't even know what was going on when he left. Like, he didn't even know about this, according to what he said. But he was there to kind of explain like what Nick was, how it was meant to be sloppy, but there was still some innuendo. But then the story shifts into it being this sort of behind the scenes conflict between Dan Schneider and the writers, and it talks about how, he was pretty abusive to the writing team. So a lot of this documentary's first episode was focused on that, just that he kind of got drunk with power, and we hear these stories a lot. Dan Schneider's not the first and won't be the last producer to be like this. This is nothing I'm not even sure if it's ever going to change, because Hollywood and that sort of lifestyle brings that sort of narcissism to the forefront of people's personalities. You understand what I'm saying? But let me tell you something. When we get to episodes 2, 3, and 4, this documentary gets very dark. And you quickly find out that the things that Schneider was accused of in the documentary, as far as being verbally abusive to coworkers, that is only scraping the surface of the wrongdoings going on at Nickelodeon behind the scenes. Now, if you know anything about child actors and sort of the history of child actors, there's a lot of issues with child actors. There's a lot of problems. There's a lot of family issues that develop from early success of the actor. Kids get exposed to things out there that they shouldn't be exposed to. Parents oftentimes let their guard down, and that is all sort of discussed a little bit here. But my God, did this thing get dark. And if you are somebody who watched Drake and Josh, it's funny, the documentary starts out with them saying this could ruin your childhood, and I'm not so sure if it'll totally ruin your childhood, because I'm not sure if that's possible unless you actually had a real life abusive childhood. It's definitely going to make you look back on some of these shows with a different eye, because there's no way I was prepared to hear the things that Drake Bell said, the stories that were told, and they back up pretty much everything that they had said with evidence. They show court documents, they corroborate it with different interviews. It wasn't like they just say things with no proof. They were backing it up. I'm not certain about going into quote unquote spoilers, because the word spoiler tends to imply it tends to imply that it's more of a movie plot. And this is a documentary with real people and real events that took place and real problems and real tragedies. atrocities, in fact. But I still don't want to go too deeply into it because I feel like if you're somebody, like my job is to tell you whether or not I think you'd be interested in this or not. And if you're somebody who grew up with these shows, or maybe you're somebody who's older and had kids that watch these shows, or maybe you had siblings or friends, it's absolutely something that needs to be watched. And something else I want to throw in there: if you are ever considering having children, or you have children now and you want to put them into Hollywood, this may actually give you, and this ain't the only thing, there's a lot of other stories like this is just mostly focused on Nickelodeon, although Disney Channel's brought up a couple times as a competitor to Nickelodeon at the time. It does kind of, if you're a parent who thought I can maybe, help my kid have a career as a child actor, this may dissuade you from all of that entirely. Or at the very least, may at least show you that you may need to take extra care and extra precautions, because there are some really, really sick people out there. The documentary gets really, really sick. Now, there were a couple of things that I would say was a slightly disappointing. So, and this is only from my perspective. Earlier in this review, I discussed the rumors of Jamie Lynn Spears and Dan Schneider. And I believe I think somebody told me, one of my friends a while ago, that it was debunked, that there was no proof that he actually did impregnate her. That was all just a BS rumor. That's not brought up at all. I was actually, they do bring up like weird stuff with Jamie Lynn Spears as far as like certain sketches and things he wanted people to do, but at no point do they actually, and this is probably for legal reasons, at no point do they actually bring up anything involving Schneider sexually assaulting anybody. That's not brought up at all. It's mostly just that his sense of humor seems to have a lot of sexual innuendo. And a lot of the actors from shows like All That and The Amanda Show appear on this, and they talk about how they were more uncomfortable than they were willing to admit, but they didn't want to say anything because their careers were on the line. And that's something you hear a lot. That is actually the whole reason as to why cancel culture and the Me Too movement even exists, because for so long people had kept their mouths shut because they were worried about their careers. There were situations here where the kids that were working for Nickelodeon were the ones that were supporting the family. Imagine coming from a broken home or from a poor family, and the person bringing in the most income is the youngest one in the household who's not even 18 yet. Like, that's wild, isn't it? That's the wildest. Like, you'd never think that'd be the case, but that's how it is for child actors. And they interview several of them who are now adults who can talk about this. Now, what I found interesting is that Dan Schneider himself did not appear physically on camera. I mean, they have archival footage. Same thing with guys like Kenan and Kel, who also did not appear here. Dan Schneider, Kenan and Kel, and Amanda Bynes, who are discussed. I mean, Amanda Bynes and Dan Schneider, a lot of part 1 and part 4, episodes 1, episodes 4, are focused on those two individuals and sort of what happened with their careers. And there isn't really a lot of Kenan and Kel, but they do appear. Like, they're there, but like in archival footage, but they don't speak. But there are quotes from Dan Schneider about, some of the things that were discussed in the documentary. His perspectives on it, but he's not straight up in it. Now, Amanda Bynes is an interesting case because she is talked about a lot. And, the last time I had heard anything about Amanda Bynes was around, I think, the early 2010s, when she was going through some kind of substance abuse problem. And they do discuss on here how a lot of kid actors and kid performers end up having serious drug and alcohol problems later in life. But nothing will prepare you for what you're going to hear about in episodes 2, 3, and 4. Really 2 and 3. If you've seen documentaries like Leaving Neverland. That documentary was very disturbing, although there's a lot of debate about whether or not that stuff is true, and some people think that those guys lied, and I'm not going to go into that right now, but it's sort of going down that rabbit hole of sexual assault, pedophilia, things that were going on behind the scenes Parents are interviewed. It's really graphic stuff. It's not something you want to watch with your family. In fact, if you've got kids who maybe watch reruns of this stuff, you may not even want to tell them about this documentary. Or on the other hand, you may want to watch it with them to kind of explain it to them and kind of explain why it's wrong and, what, to protect them. It all depends on your parent. I'm not here to tell you how to parent your kids. That's not my job, but I'm telling you what the subject matter is, and it does get very, very graphic. It doesn't show anything that's too graphic. Don't worry about seeing any kind of, pictures and things like that, but they do actually highlight court documents that go into explicit details of some of the things that these actors dealt with from their older creeps, older people. And the most heartbreaking thing about the documentary, besides just the mental health of these kids, who are now mostly adults, was the support that some of these behind the scenes, producers got from others in the industry. I mean, there's a part where, and again, I don't want to go into all the details. I want you to watch it for yourself, but I want to tell you there are several actors and producers and writers that are named as being people who were defending criminals. And the letters, there were letters that were written to a judge, and the really sad part is that some of the actors that were brought up that wrote these letters to help get a lesser sentencing for these criminals are people who were big sitcom and television stars, and people who I grew up watching and who many of you grew up watching. I want to keep that to myself because I want you to see the documentary. And it's better if you see it with your own eyes and get full context and have me just tell you about it. But I'm letting you know what to prepare for. Ultimately, this documentary is still very fresh. It's only a couple of weeks old, so we do not have complete fallout of what's going to happen from this. If you remember, the R. Kelly documentary from Netflix led to him being tried again and led to people revisiting that story. I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know if more stories are going to come out now, because typically what happens is when one story comes out, 2, 3, 4, it becomes a big snowball effect. I don't know. And we might have to experience the ramifications of this documentary in real time. But it was a fascinating view, disturbing, sad, and in some ways tough to watch. In some ways. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad that I stepped away from Nickelodeon prior to. I feel like if I was a young kid watching stuff like Drake and Josh, and I did watch a little bit of the Amanda Show, but it was on the air well after I stopped watching Nick. But if I watched it when I was even younger and more impressionable, and then I saw this, I'd probably be even more affected by it. I'm still pretty affected by it. I mean, there's, especially episodes 2 and 3, I mean, there's surprises, and not in a nice way. Very disturbing surprises. Anyways, check out Quiet on the Set. It's streaming right now on Max. It's something else, man.